Now let's start in detail about SAML. So until this that we have seen, right? Like that day, we have seen what is SAML and how the SAML will be transferring the data between both the applications, which means identity and service provider. So identity provider is nothing but a tool that is taking care of performing the authentication authorization. So here, in this scenario, Okta will be the identity provider and the service provider will be the application where the end users are getting some service. So that application has been integrated with Okta for SSO. So that we will call it a service provider. So whenever a user tries to log into the service provider, for example, whenever they are hitting the URL, maybe https salesforce.com. This is a URL that they will be hitting. Once they hit this URL, they are accessing the service provider, basically. That URL will be routed to the Okta URL, because Okta is an identity provider system. So in service provider, we have a configuration that whenever the request comes into the organization's Salesforce application, that request should automatically route to the IDP identity provider, which is Okta here. You will be prompted for user ID and password in the Okta console. And if you enter your user ID and password, authentication authorization will take place in Okta. Once that is done, Okta will again send a note or send a response back to the application Salesforce application saying that the user have a proper access and the user is an authenticated user. Likewise, it will send a response from identity provider to service provider. That is what the flow will work basically. There will be another flow. The first one that I said. If you are hitting https salesforce.com, it's an ESP initiated flow service provider. Initiated flow because you are entering the service provider's URL. But now let's take an example. You are logging into Okta. And in Okta you can see the tiles list of tiles available in the Okta console. From in the tile you can see a Salesforce application tile also. If you click that or if you copy that, what to say? If you copy that URL for that application tile, you can see the URL starts with https authorizations.com. Let's say, if it is a cognizant.com. From that user access the Salesforce application. Automatically, he will be routed to the https salesforce.com URL. This is an IDP-based URL. IDP-initiated URL. You are trying to access an application. Access from Okta URL. But if you access it from the Salesforce URL, that we will call it a service provider. Initiated SSO flow. Is it clear? Any questions on the IDP and ESP? Okay. Now let's see how that SAML works. So here you can see the step-by-step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First user logs into SSO, which means user logs into Okta. From Okta, he's trying to access an application. In this scenario, you can take Salesforce application. He's trying to access the application. So that is the second step. What application will do is service provider. Check the user credential with the identity provider. Which means if you access that URL, if you access that Okta URL, what happens is Okta will send a note to the service provider. Salesforce application here. We said about response, so Okta will send a response to the Salesforce application. That's what here it says. Service providers check the user credentials with the identity provider. Identity provider is sending a response to that application, and application will validate it, and it will allow the user to access that application. That is step 3. Now step 4. Identity provider send an authorization notification to the service provider. I think this is something different. Let me come from the beginning. User logs into SSO. Here it is not SSO actually, it is application. User logs into application. I think I have to edit it. I will do it. User logs into application, which means HTTPS Salesforce.com. He is logging into the application. And he is trying to access that Salesforce web page. That's what he is doing. So that is the second step. Third step. What it will do is service provider, which is the Salesforce. Salesforce will say, okay, there is a request came from this user. He wants to access this page, our Salesforce page. Salesforce application. It will know that. What the service provider will do? Service provider will send a note to identity provider, and identity provider will validate that information. Whoever is logging in and whether the person who is logging in he have access to that application or not. That's what here it is mentioned. Service providers check these user credentials and in the identity provider. So service provider will send a note to the identity provider for checking the user credentials and the authorization information. And once the identity provider validates that information, I'm saying I said service provider will request the identity provider to perform these actions like validate credentials, validate the credit authorizations mechanisms. Once it is came to identity provider will validate that, an identity provider have to send that validation detail back to the application. That validation message will have that, yes, this is an authenticated user. This user have access to this application. That message. Or it will send a message like, no, this is not an appropriate user. It's not a proper user. So you should not grant access to that user and application access. So likewise it will send a message. That's what it is mentioned as step 4. Identity provider sends an authorization and authentication messages back to the service provider. The flow is very simple. If you start from service provider will send a note to identity provider. Identity provider will validate that information and it will send back the message back to the application, to the service provider. And once that is done, user can able to log into the applications, whatever the application that he tries to access. Any questions? It is just a over high view flow. It's not like a detailed one. Next slide we will see in detail about that. So this is, in detail flow, how SAML works. Yeah, so here you can see 3 components. First one is identity provider, which is Okta in this scenario. This is service provider, which is Salesforce in this scenario. And this is a browser. So this browser can be anything. It can be Google Chrome or it can be Mozilla. Or it can be Edge. Whatever the browser it is. Now user is going to access the Salesforce application from browser only. That's the first step.